Welcome to The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. In this presentation, we'll explore the author's compelling argument that the prenatal environment profoundly shapes a child's future physical and emotional well-being. Dr. Verney suggests that unborn children possess a form of consciousness and are responsive to various external stimuli, including the mother's emotions, sounds, and music. This work encourages expectant parents to actively engage with their unborn child, fostering a nurturing and positive prenatal connection. Let's begin with the first episode. Chapter 1, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. This book is about many things: the origins of human consciousness, the growth and development of the unborn and newly born child, but principally it is about the shaping of the human mind, about how we become who we are. And it is based on the discovery that the unborn child is a feeling, remembering, aware being, and because he is, what happens to him, what happens to all of us, in the 9 months between conception and birth, molds and shapes personality, drives, and ambitions in very important ways. This realization and the remarkable body of research it springs from take us well beyond what we know or think we know about the emotional development of the unborn child. And while scientifically, that is enormously exciting, among other things, it forever displaces the old Freudian notion that personality does not begin forming until the second or third year. Even more exciting is the way it deepens and enriches the meaning and importance of parenting, especially mothering. In fact, the single most gratifying aspect of our new knowledge is what it reveals about the pregnant woman and her role in shaping and guiding her unborn child's personality. Her tools are her thoughts and feelings. And with them, she has the opportunity to create a human being favored with more advantages than previously thought possible. I do not make the claim that everything that happens to her in these critical months irrevocably shapes her baby's future. Many things go into the molding of a new life. Maternal thoughts and feelings are just one element in the mix, but what makes them a unique element is that unlike givens such as genetic inheritance, they are controllable. A woman can make them as positive a force as she wishes. Most emphatically, that does not mean a child's future happiness hinges on his mother's ability to think bright thoughts 24 hours a day. Occasional doubts, ambivalences, and anxieties are a normal part of pregnancy and, as we shall see later, may actually help an unborn baby's development. What it does mean is that an expectant or prospective mother now has at her disposal another way of actively affecting her baby's emotional development for the good. Though one could use the word breakthrough to describe this realization, it has grown out of other recent findings. In the late 1960s, for instance, we discovered a post-birth system of mother-child communication called bonding. In many ways, our new research is a logical extension of this earlier finding, since it moves the communication system back a step and places it in the womb. Medically, much the same is true. Considering what we have learned recently about the effects of maternal diet, drinking, and drug taking on the unborn child, and also about the role emotions play in sickness and health, it follows that a mother's thoughts and feelings would have a potentially beneficial effect upon her unborn child. It also makes sense that our new knowledge would enhance the father's part in pregnancy. A relationship with a loving and sensitive man provides a woman with an ongoing system of emotional support during pregnancy. And if, in our ignorance, we have disrupted this delicate system by rudely excluding the man, now that we have discovered, or more accurately, rediscovered, just how important emotional security and nurturing are to a woman and to her unborn child, he can finally be restored to his rightful place in pregnancy. These new ideas come directly out of laboratories in America, Canada, England, France, Sweden, Germany, Austria, New Zealand, and Switzerland, where for the past 2 decades investigators have been quietly and painstakingly assembling a dramatically new view of the fetus, or birth, of the beginning stages of life. What you are reading is a first attempt to bring news of their revolutionary work to a wider public. Because it is a first attempt, some of what follows will necessarily be speculative, though I will attempt to separate what we know from what we only think we know. Inevitably, some of it will also be controversial. I do not expect everyone to agree on each and every point. But I am convinced this book, and even more, this entire area of exploration, is one of bright, unbounding hope. Hope for physicians, because it will allow them to prevent many of the missed opportunities of pregnancy and birth. Hope for mothers and fathers, because it deepens and enriches the nature of parenting, and most of all, the hope for the unborn child. He is the chief beneficiary of our new knowledge. Far different, far more aware, responsive, and loving than anyone had imagined. He deserves, in fact, requires, a more sensitive, nurturing, humane kind of care in the womb and at birth than he gets now. French obstetrician Frédéric Leboyer, author of Birth Without Violence, sensed this intuitively, which is why he has argued so compellingly for more gentle birthing methods. What we have learned clinically confirms his views. Providing the newborn with a warm, reassuring, humane environment does make a difference because the child is very much aware of how he is born. He senses gentleness, softness, and a caring touch, and he responds to them much as he senses and responds in a quite different way to the bright lights, electrical beeps, and cold, impersonal atmosphere that are so often associated with a medical birth. But this knowledge and the revolution it encompasses also goes beyond Leboyer and beyond any single notion of childbearing. It throws open the unborn child's mind to us for the first time. Most remarkably, it reveals that he is conscious or aware, though his consciousness is not as deep or complex as an adult's. He is incapable of understanding the shades of meaning an adult can put into a simple word or gesture. But, as some new studies show, they will be discussed in more detail in the next chapter, he is sensitive to remarkably subtle emotional nuances. He can sense and react not only to large, undifferentiated emotions such as love and hate, but also to more shaded, complex feeling states like ambivalence and ambiguity. Precisely at what moment his brain cells acquire this ability is still unknown. One group of investigators believes something like consciousness exists from the very first moment of conception. As evidence, they point to the thousands of perfectly healthy women who repeatedly abort spontaneously. There is speculation that in the very first weeks, perhaps even hours, after conception, the fertilized ovum possesses enough self-awareness to sense rejection and enough will to act on it. This notion and the evidence to support it will be examined in more detail later. For now, as interesting as it is, this theory is just that, a theory, not proven fact. Most of what is known with real authority, because it has been confirmed by physiological, neurological, biochemical, and psychological studies, is known about the child from the 6th month in utero onward. By almost any measure, he is a fascinating human being at this point. He can already remember, hear, even learn. The unborn child is in fact a very quick study, as a group of investigators demonstrated in what has come to be regarded as a classic report. They taught 16 unborn babies to respond to a vibrating sensation by kicking. Normally, an unborn child won't react that way to such a gentle sensation. He will ignore it, in fact. But in this case, the investigators were able to create what behavioral psychologists call a conditioned or learned response in their young subjects by first exposing them several times to something that would make them kick naturally, a loud noise. It was made a few feet from each mother, and her child's reaction was monitored by sensors strapped on her abdomen. Then the investigators introduced the vibration. Each child was exposed to it immediately after the noise was made near her mother. The researchers' assumption was that after enough exposures, eventually the association between vibrations and kicking would become so automatic in the baby's minds that they would kick even when the vibration was used without the noise. And it proved correct. The vibration became their cue, and their kicking in response to it, a learned behavior. This study, which provides a good glimpse of the unborn child's capabilities, also does more. It shows one of the ways personality characteristics and traits begin forming in utero. Our likes and dislikes, fears and phobias. In other words, all the distinct behaviors that make us uniquely ourselves are in part also the product of conditioned learning. And as we have just seen, the womb is where this special kind of learning begins. To illustrate how it shapes future traits, let's consider the sensation of anxiety. What could produce the roots of a deep-seated, long-term anxiety in an unborn child? One possibility is his mother's smoking. In a remarkable study done several years ago, Dr. Michael Lieberman showed that an unborn child grows emotionally agitated, as measured by the quickening of his heartbeat, each time his mother thinks of having a cigarette. She doesn't even have to put it to her lips or light a match. Just the idea of having a cigarette is enough to upset him. Naturally, the fetus has no way of knowing his mother is smoking or thinking about it, but he is intellectually sophisticated enough to associate the experience of her smoking with the unpleasant sensation it produces in him. This is caused by the drop in his oxygen supply. Smoking lowers the oxygen content of the maternal blood passing the placenta, which is physiologically harmful to him, but possibly even more harmful are the psychological effects of maternal smoking. It thrusts him into a chronic state of uncertainty and fear. He never knows when that unpleasant physical sensation will reoccur, and that's the kind of situation which does predispose toward a deep-seated, conditioned anxiety. Another, happier kind of learning that goes on in utero is speech. Each of us has an idiosyncratic rhythm to our talk. Often, this is so muted that those around us don't notice it, but the difference always shows up on sound analysis tests. Our speech patterns are as distinct as our fingerprints. The origins of these differences are no great mystery. They come from our mothers. We learn our speech by copying hers. Logically enough, scientists used to assume this copying didn't occur until well into infancy. But now, many of them have come to agree with Dr. Henry Truby, professor of pediatrics, linguistics, and anthropology at the University of Miami, that this learning process begins earlier in utero. As evidence, Dr. Truby points to recent studies which show the fetus hears clearly from the 6th month in utero, and even more startling, that he moves his body rhythm to his mother's speech. Considering his acute hearing, it should come as no surprise that the unborn child is also capable of learning a bit about music. A 4 or 5-month-old fetus definitely responds to sound and melody, and responds in very discriminating ways. Put Vivaldi on the phonograph, and even the most agitated baby relaxes. Put Beethoven on, and even the calmest child starts kicking and moving. Of course, personality is much more than the sum of what we learn, in or out of the womb. My point is that since we have finally identified some of the early experiences which shape future traits and characteristics, a woman can now begin actively influencing her child's life well before birth. One way is by giving up or cutting back on cigarettes during pregnancy. Another way is by talking to her child. He really does hear, and even more importantly, he responds to what he hears. Soft, soothing talk makes him feel loved and wanted. Not because he understands the words. Obviously, they are well beyond his comprehension. But the tone of what is being said isn't. He is mature enough intellectually to sense the emotional tone of the maternal voice. It's even possible to begin teaching an unborn baby. At the very least, a pregnant woman who spends a few minutes each day listening to soothing music could make her child feel more relaxed and tranquil. At most, that early exposure might create in the child a lifelong musical interest. It did for Boris Brott, conductor of the Hamilton, Ontario Philharmonic Symphony. One evening, a few years ago, I heard Brott interviewed on the radio. He is a colorful man with a gift for storytelling. On this particular night, he was being quizzed about opera. Toward the end of the discussion, the interviewer asked him how he had become interested in music. It was a simple enough question. Asked, I suspect, more to kill time than anything else, but it stopped Brott. He hesitated for a moment and said, "You know, this may sound strange, but music has been a part of me since before birth." Perplexed, the interviewer asked him to explain. "Well," said Brott, "as a young man, I was mystified by this unusual ability I had to play certain pieces sight unseen. I'd be conducting a score for the first time, and suddenly, the cello line would jump out at me. I'd know the flow of the piece even before I turned the page of the score. One day, I mentioned this to my mother, who is a professional cellist. I thought she'd be intrigued because it was always the cello line that was so distinct in my mind. She was. But when she heard what the pieces were, the mystery quickly solved itself. All the scores I knew sight unseen were ones she had played while she was pregnant with me." A few years ago, at a conference, I encountered another example of prenatal learning that was not only as arresting as Brought's, but also supported Dr. Truby's notions about speech forming in utero. It came from a young American mother who had lived in Toronto during her pregnancy. One afternoon, she found her 2-year-old daughter sitting on the living room floor chanting to herself, "Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out." The woman said she recognized the words immediately. They were part of a Lamaze exercise. But how had her child picked them out? Her first thought was that the youngster had overheard them on television, but she quickly realized that was impossible. They lived in Oklahoma City, and any program about it her daughter would have seen would have been on the American version of Lamaze. Those programs are used only in the Canadian version. Since that was the one she had taken, there was only one possible explanation. Her daughter had overheard and memorized the words while she was still in the womb. Not too long ago, a story like this or Brought's would have been fortunate to earn a footnote in a medical paper. But such incidents are now finally receiving the serious scientific consideration they deserve, due to the rise of an exciting new discipline called prenatal psychology. Centered primarily in Europe and drawing most of its practitioners from obstetrics, psychiatry, and clinical psychology, the discipline is unique not only in the unusual nature of its subject matter, but also in the strong practical bent of its research. Indeed, in the short space of a decade since its creation, we have already learned enough about the unborn child's mind and emotions to help rescue thousands of youngsters from a lifetime of debilitating emotional disorders. I say we, because it was the promise of preventing such tragedies that led me into prenatal psychology. Over the years, in hospitals, while teaching, and in my practice, I have seen hundreds of people who have been deeply scarred by destructive prenatal influences, patients whose afflictions can be explained only in terms of what happened to them in the womb and at birth. Nor is my experience unique. Many of my fellow psychiatrists have treated similar cases. Prenatal psychology, it seems to me, finally offers a way of preventing many of these tragedies from occurring in the first place. Beyond this, we have a way of materially improving an entire generation's chances of entering life free of the corrosive mental and emotional disorders that have beset youngsters in the past. I'm not suggesting that we have a universal panacea which will magically banish our ills, nor am I suggesting that every trivial emotional upset that touches us stretches back to the womb. Life is not static. What happens at 20, at 40, even at 60 certainly influences and alters us. But it is important to point out that events affect us quite differently in the first stages of life. An adult, and to a lesser degree a child, has had time to develop defenses and responses. He can soften or deflect the impact of experience. An unborn child cannot. What affects him does so directly. That's why maternal emotions etch themselves so deeply on his psyche and why their tug remains so powerful later in life. Major personality characteristics seldom change. If optimism is engraved on the mind of an unborn child, it will take a great deal of adversity later to erase it. Will this child be an artist or a mechanic? Prefer Rembrandt's to Cezanne? Be left-handed or right-handed? All these fine details remain beyond current knowledge. And frankly, I think it is just as well. To be able to predict very specific personality traits with absolute precision would take much of the mystery out of life. Where our new knowledge can legitimately make a difference is in helping to identify and prevent the roots of serious personality problems. Most women know that to take care of themselves emotionally means automatically to take care of their unborn children. As scientists, we have also gone beyond that. I believe our growing ability to spot in utero potentially troubling and disturbed behavior can be of immense benefit to thousands of yet-to-be-born children, vets, to their parents, and ultimately to society. To a small degree, we have already begun exercising this ability, often with surprising results, as the following study illustrates. The researchers began with the assumption that fetal activity is frequently an accurate sign of anxiety. If a child's behavior in the womb has any predictive meaning at all, they reasoned, the most active fetuses would one day grow into the most anxious youngsters. That is exactly what happened. The babies who moved around the most in utero grew into the most anxious children. They were not simply a bit more fretful than normal. They were bursting, bubbling over with anxiety. These 2- and 3-year-olds felt an almost heartbreaking discomfort, even in the most common social situations. They shied away from their teachers, from their schoolmates, from making friends, and from all human contact. They were most comfortable, most relaxed, and least anxious when they were alone. How they will behave later on cannot be predicted with absolute certainty, of course. Perhaps a good marriage, or a particularly rewarding career, parenthood, therapy, or something or someone else will end up counteracting some of these anxieties. Yet it seems safe to say that most of those frightened youngsters will still be scurrying into corners to avoid encounters at 30. The difference is that then they will be trying to avoid husbands, wives, and their own children instead of teachers and playmates. The cycle will repeat itself. It doesn't have to. If more pregnant women were to start communicating with their children, it would represent a monumental beginning. Just imagine how you would feel alone in a room for 6, 7, or 8 months without any emotional or intellectual stimulation. That is, more or less, the net effect of ignoring an unborn child. Obviously, his emotional and intellectual needs are far more primitive than ours. The important point is that he has them. He has to feel loved and wanted just as urgently, perhaps even more urgently, than we do. He has to be talked to and thought of. Otherwise, his spirit, and often his body too, begin wilting. Studies of pregnant schizophrenic and psychotic women testify eloquently to the devastating effects of emotional neglect in utero. In these cases, the women simply cannot help it. The effects of mental disease make meaningful communication with their children impossible, but that silence or chaos often leaves deep scars on the youngsters. At birth, they tend to have far more physical and emotional problems than the babies of mentally healthy women. In the following chapters, the question of how all this communication occurs will be examined. The point here is that it does, and that we can do something about it. To a certain extent, we can even measure its quality and directness. By and large, the personality of the unborn child a woman bears is a function of the quality of mother-child communication and also of its specificity. If the communication was abundant, rich, and most important, nurturing, the chances are very good that the baby will be robust, healthy, and happy. This communication is an important part of bonding. And since every investigator who has studied bonding after birth agrees that it is immensely beneficial to both mother and child, it stands to reason that bonding before birth would be equally important. Indeed, I believe it to be far more beneficial. Life, even life in the first few minutes and hours, offers endless distractions: sights, sounds, smells, and noises. Life in the womb, on the other hand, was more constant, bounded completely by his mother, and everything she has said, felt, thought, and hoped. Even outside noises were conducted through her. How can he not be profoundly affected by her? Even something as seemingly mundane and neutral as her heartbeat has an effect. Without question, it is an essential part of his life support system. The child does not know that, of course. He only knows that the reassuring rhythm of its beat is one of the major constellations in his universe. He falls asleep to it, wakes to it, moves to it, rests to it. Because the human mind, even the human mind in utero, is a symbol-making entity, the fetus gradually attaches a metaphorical meaning to it. Its steady thump-thump comes to symbolize tranquility, security, and love to him. In its presence, he usually flourishes. This was demonstrated a few years ago in a unique and ingenious study. It consisted merely of piping a tape of a human heartbeat into a nursery filled with newborn babies. The researchers assumed that if the maternal heartbeat had any emotional significance, the newborns in the nursery, on the days it played, would behave differently from the babies there on the days it did not. That is precisely what happened, except it happened in a much more conclusive way than had been expected. The scientists, fairly certain some differences would show up when they designed the study, were stunned by the number and magnitude of the ones that occurred. In virtually every way, the heartbeat babies did better. In most cases, much better. They ate more, weighed better, slept more, breathed better, cried less, and got sick less. Not because they received special treatment or had superior parents or better doctors, but simply because they were exposed to a $2 tape recording of a heartbeat. Of course, that's something a woman has no control over. Her heartbeat operates, in a sense, on automatic pilot, but she can learn to understand her emotions and deal with them more effectively. And that's vital to the well-being of her child, because his mind is shaped by her thoughts and feelings in fundamental ways. Whether his mind evolves into something essentially hard, angular, and dangerous, or soft, flowing, and open depends largely on whether her thoughts and emotions are positive and reinforcing or negative and etched with ambivalence. This absolutely does not mean that occasional doubts and uncertainty will damage your child. Such feelings are natural and harmless. What I'm talking about is a clear-cut, continual pattern of behavior. Only that kind of intense, ongoing emotion is capable of creating the kinds of conditioned learning that will negatively affect a child. A physically difficult birth with its attendant emotional strains does not change things. It is what you want and feel and communicate to the baby that matters. This is why what a woman thinks about her child makes such an important difference. Her thoughts, her love or rejection, or ambivalence, begin defining and shaping his emotional life. What she creates are not specific traits such as extroversion or optimism or aggressiveness. Those are too specific, too finely tuned to apply to the mind of a 6-month-old unborn child. What is forming are broader, more deeply rooted tendencies, such as a sense of security or self-esteem. From these, specific character traits develop later in childhood, as in those youngsters I mentioned earlier. They were not born shy. They were born anxious. Painful shyness may grow out of that anxiety. A happier example is security. A secure person is deeply self-confident. How can he not be when he has been told from the very edge of consciousness onward that he is wanted and loved? Such attributes as optimism, confidence, friendliness, and extroversion flow naturally from that sense. All these are precious things to give a child, and they can be given so easily. By creating a warm, emotionally enriching environment in utero, a woman can make a decisive difference in everything her child feels, hopes, dreams, thinks, and accomplishes throughout life. During these months, a woman is her baby's conduit to the world. Everything that affects her affects him, and nothing affects her as deeply or hits with such lacerating impact as worries about her husband or partner. Because of that, few things are more dangerous to a child, emotionally and physically, than a father who abuses or neglects his pregnant wife. Virtually everyone who has studied an expectant father's role, and sadly, so far, only a handful of researchers have, has found that his support is absolutely essential to her and thus to their child's well-being. That fact alone makes the man an important part of the prenatal equation. An equally vital factor in the child's emotional well-being is his father's commitment to the marriage. Any number of things can influence a man's ability to relate to his partner, from the way he feels about his wife or his own father to his job pressures or his own insecurities. Ideally, of course, the time to work out these problems is before conceiving, not during a pregnancy. But recent studies also indicate that what affects his sense of commitment most deeply, for better or worse, is when and if he begins bonding with his child. For obvious physiological reasons, a man is at something of a disadvantage here. The child is not an organic part of him, but not all the physical impediments of pregnancy are insurmountable. Something as ordinary as talking is a good example. A child hears his father's voice in utero, and there is solid evidence that hearing that voice makes a big emotional difference. In cases where a man talked to his child in utero using short, soothing words, the newborn was able to pick out his father's voice in a room, even in the first hour or two of life. More than pick it up, he responds to it emotionally. If he's crying, for instance, he'll stop. That familiar, soothing sound tells him he is safe. Bonding also directly influences the expectant father in more general ways. Stereotypes often portray him as well-meaning but bumbling. This creates an insidious crisis of confidence in many men. In defense, they tend to withdraw from their wives during pregnancy to the safety of friends and colleagues who provide them with respect and validation. Bonding is a very important way, to break this damaging cycle and to involve the man more deeply and meaningfully in his child's life from the very beginning. And the sooner he involves himself, the more his new son or daughter is likely to benefit. This view of fathering is drastically new. In fact, most of what is in the pages that follow is new, and some of it is frankly radical. Radical in the original sense of that word, a sharp departure from past practices. But that, and nothing less than that, is necessary if we hope to produce future generations of increasingly healthy, emotionally secure children. Chapter 1 is now complete. That's it for today's episode. Stay tuned for the next one. Until then, take care and see you soon. Thank you.